This video shows the steps that were taken in the replacement of a cabinet floor under a sink. The project was particularly challenging because it required working around two water pipes, a drain pipe, and an electrical conduit. As you can see, a long undetected leak damaged the floor of this kitchen cabinet beyond repair. The floor would have to be torn out and replaced, but first things first. The source of the leak was identified as a damaged faucet, and the faucet was replaced. With the risk of further water damage eliminated, attention turned to removal of the old floor and all fasteners. Safety glasses, a mask, and gloves were worn to protect against flying dust and splintered wood. After removal of the old floor and hardware, the surface underneath was cleaned and repaired as needed. The old cabinet floor that was removed was only 1/8 to 3/16 of an inch thick. It fit tightly within grooves that had been cut into the left and right cabinet walls. The 1/4 inch plywood that would be used for the new floor was too thick to fit into these grooves, but the grooves would still serve a very useful purpose. The bottom edge of the grooves showed where the bottom surface of the new floor needed to be and would be used for guidance. The old floor had been stapled down along a 3/4 inch thick support board running across the back wall and also just inside the cabinet doors in a space just a 1/4 inch wide. The plan for attaching the new floor would be to staple it to the same backboard as was done before. But in the front of the cabinet, instead of attaching it to the tiny strip within the door framework, it would be stapled to the toe kick just inside the cabinet. The toe kick appeared to be about 1 inch thick and would provide substantially more surface area for the staples to grab. To provide ample support for the new floor, a crossbeam would be created. A 3/4 inch thick scrap board was selected for the beam to span the width of the cabinet. It was cut 1/8 of an inch less than the measured width of the cabinet to allow for expansion and contraction over time. 2 scrap deck boards were cut to become support brackets for the beam. Before fastening the brackets to the walls, they were set roughly in place with the beam resting on top. Shims were used under the brackets to bring the height of the beam into alignment with the bottom line of the wall grooves. The beam was then removed and the brackets were fastened to the walls near their outer edges. A pneumatic nailer and 2 1/4 inch brads were used. With the brackets secured, the support beam was centered on top of them and fastened down with 2 1/4 inch brads. Care was taken to avoid contact with the hardware holding the brackets in place. Time for careful measuring. Realizing that the interior of the cabinet might not be perfectly rectangular, measurements were taken across the back as well as the front, and on both sides from front to back. Strips of paper were wrapped around each pipe to measure the circumference of each. Pipe diameter was then calculated using the formula D equals C divided by pi, meaning diameter equals circumference divided by 3.14. 1/4 inch thick plywood underlayment left over from a recent floor project was the material selected for the new floor. It was cut to the length and width of the entire cabinet, allowing 1/8 of an inch in each direction for expansion and contraction. Careful measuring and marking of the floor piece followed to show where cuts would be made for all of the pipes and the door framework. 1/8 inch of space around the pipes was factored in and midpoints for pipe holes were marked. Next up, finding the right sized spade auger bits to cut holes for the 3 smallest pipes using the drill. While the 3/4 inch and 7/8 inch bits would have created holes large enough for the electrical conduit and the water pipes, they would not have provided the extra 1/8 inch of space needed. Therefore, the 7/8 inch bit was selected for the electrical conduit and the 1-inch bit for the water pipes. The hole for the drain would need to be considerably larger than the others. A jigsaw would be used to create the drain hole following the use of an auger bit to create a small hole for the jigsaw blade. Before clamping the floor piece for drilling the holes, sacrificial boards were secured underneath. This was done to prevent splintering of the plywood upon breakthrough. With the drill rotation set to forward, clockwise, the holes were made. Once the holes had been created, the remaining cuts for the door framework and the electrical conduit were completed using the jigsaw. There remained one final step before the last cuts in the floor piece would be made. A sheet of vinyl flooring left over from that previously mentioned project would eventually be used to cover the cabinet floor to make it as water resistant as possible. The floor piece would now be used to mark the locations of all holes and other cuts that would need to be replicated on the vinyl. Weights would be used to hold everything in place. Important. Since marking would be done on the undecorated flip side of the flooring, the floor piece also needed to be flipped. Had this not been done, all cuts would have ended up in the wrong place. Once a mirror image of the floor piece had been drawn onto the vinyl, the final cuts on the floor piece could be made. The goal was to keep as much of the piece intact as possible, cutting only where absolutely necessary. Key to remember: 1. In order to be successfully seated in place inside the cabinet, each panel would first need to be able to clear everything from above and from side to side. 2. At each hole, cuts would need to be made precisely at the top and bottom as shown, so that if a line were drawn between the 2 points, it would cross the midpoint of the hole. It seemed pretty clear that the placement of panels 1 and 2 inside the cabinet would not be met with any problems, but there was concern about the size of panel 3. Could a panel of this size be tilted upward enough under the existing dishwasher lines to be slid all the way to the back wall of the cabinet? A quick simulation would be performed to answer this question. A piece of corrugated cardboard was cut to the approximate length and width of panel 3, and an attempt was made to place it in the designated spot inside the cabinet. Result: the cardboard could not be set in place without bending it. Conclusion: since plywood does not bend, panel 3 would need to be cut in half in order to fit, meaning 4 panels would be necessary. Most of the remaining cuts would be made with a circular saw, which would call for the selected good side, in this case the top side, to be face down. The final cut lines were drawn on the flip side of the floor piece using a pen, a square, and a 48-inch aluminum ruler. The first cut created panel number 4, which was then placed in the cabinet to be checked for proper fit. No issues here. Panel 3 was cut next and was then slid into place easily. So far, so good. With the final cut, panels 1 and 2 were created. They were set in place, and thankfully, everything fit together nicely. Naturally, it was hoped that this wood would never come into contact with any water following installation, but the risk of exposure had been made all too clear. Prior to being fastened down, the panels were removed from the cabinet to be treated with a coat of oil-based polyurethane as an added layer of protection in the event of another leak in the future. Following treatment, the panels were allowed to dry and were then placed back in the cabinet. Out of an abundance of caution, the polyurethane would be allowed to cure for a week before the panels would be secured in place with staples. Uncured polyurethane is flammable, and pneumatic fasteners can cause sparks upon firing. Meanwhile, the vinyl flooring was ready to be cut. The plan was to use one single piece of vinyl for the entire floor, rather than multiple pieces. Slits made from the edges to the pipe holes would be made diagonally so as to avoid them lining up with the spaces between panels. Care would be taken to err on the side of cutting too little rather than cutting too much. All of the cuts would be done with a sharp utility knife. A metal straight edge would be used as a guide for the straight cuts. When the initial cutting had been completed, the flooring was ready to be placed in the cabinet. The need for some adjustments was expected. As anticipated, there were multiple issues with fit. Photos were taken of the problem areas to serve as guides for making corrections. The flooring was then removed, trimmed, and placed back in the cabinet for reevaluation. After removal and replacement 3 times, success. Once the vinyl was cut to a proper fit, it was set aside. Fastening down the panels would be next. The location of the toe kick to which the panels would be stapled had been marked on both side walls of the cabinet. A laser level came in handy for showing where to staple. All 4 panels were stapled to the toe kick near the front of the cabinet and to the support board at the back. 1¼ inch staples were installed using a Banks 18 gauge 1/4 inch pneumatic crown stapler. Finally, the vinyl flooring was laid in place. A waterproof sealant was applied around pipes and along edges and seams to provide one last deterrent to moisture damage. Dynaflex 230 clear sealant went on white, but would become transparent after curing. Here's the finished product after the curing of the sealant. A brand new, water-resistant cabinet floor built to stand the test of time. Thanks for viewing.